Chapter 7, Protein, Screencast 7. This is the last screencast for protein, and it'll be focusing on a couple of other health issues that are tied in or very much associated with protein. The first is vegetarian diets. So now we are actually talking about diets that are rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes, grains, and there are quite a few health benefits that are associated with this type of a diet. People that have a vegetarian diet are increasing the intake of fiber, phytochemicals, antioxidant nutrients, and they're not consuming nearly as much saturated fat and cholesterol as those individuals that are mostly consuming animal-based proteins. So one thing that is of important note, that being a vegetarian may actually play a very major role against obesity. Now, when we look at the eating patterns of vegetarians, they vary. One thing that I want to point out, and I think a lot of people kind of struggle with this as far as what can a basic or what typical vegetarian can consume. A vegan will be that type of a vegetarian that does not consume any animal product whatsoever. So it's strictly plant-based. Then you have a lacto-vegetarian. These are going to be those vegetarians that include dairy in their diet. So the prefix is very important. So the prefix here is indicating what they actually consume in addition to plant. So here we have lacto-ovo-vegetarians. They will consume eggs and dairy. You may have heard of a pescatarian. Those are vegetarians that will include fish as part of their diet. But one thing to keep in mind here is because you are focusing primarily on incomplete proteins, diets may be low in a number of really important nutrients, especially looking at high biological value proteins, since once again, that's mostly animal proteins, riboflavin, vitamin D, B12, calcium, iron, zinc. So these are all nutrients that a vegetarian may be at risk of not getting enough of, especially vegans. Now, we talked about this earlier in the very first screencast. So one thing that a vegetarian can do to avoid nutrient deficiency is complementary protein. And the best example, and probably one of the more famous examples, as we talked about earlier, beans and rice. Now, riboflavin, that can actually come from leafy green vegetables, cereals, whole grain breads, yeast, and legumes. Vitamin D can come from fortified foods such as soy milk, dietary supplements, or exposure from the sun. Calcium quite often can be obtained from other foods than dairy, such as orange juice, soy milk, and tofu. Those are all fortified with calcium. Green leafy vegetables, although it is important to keep in mind that the calcium found in leafy greens is not well absorbed. And of course, supplements. We really do want to try to get as many of our essential nutrients through our diet and not necessarily relying upon supplements. If we look at some additional issues, vitamin B12, that can come from fortified foods, also supplements. Iron can actually be obtained within whole grains, cereals, dried fruits, nuts, legumes. But the thing to keep in mind here, this is non-heme iron. So this is not the type of iron that you're going to find in red meat. And the thing to remember here, when you're consuming these types of iron, it is critical that you consume them with foods that are high in vitamin C, because that actually is necessary to enhance the absorption of this iron, which typically, because it's plant-based, is not absorbed as readily as heme iron. Zinc can come from whole grains, cereals, nuts, legumes. But one thing to keep in mind here is there are some things in some of these foods that will have an impact on the absorption of zinc, and phytic acid is definitely one of those things. Grains are probably best consumed in breads because leavening reduces the influence of phytic acid. Here we basically have a food plan for vegetarians, and it's based on MyPlate. I'm not going to go through all of this, but if you follow this, it actually gives you a very good idea of the nutrients that you're getting and making sure that all the nutrients are being consumed in a vegetarian. The last thing we have to keep in mind, do children and infants have special concerns when it comes to protein? Probably the most common when we're talking about children that are vegetarians, and there's lots of them out there, deficiencies of iron, B12, vitamin D, zinc, and calcium. It really is important to be careful of bulky, high-fiber, low-calorie foods. These can actually cause a feeling of fullness, and they're also a source of phytic acid, and that's going to have an impact on the absorption of iron. And it also is important to have highly concentrated source of energy to meet the caloric and nutrient needs of a growing child.